I just realized that during all these years working in the criminal investigation department, I've only seen it once.
Do you like watching Criminality Patrol? Help us record new episodes. Support us through Hero and watch us without ads, plus get access to additional content that's not available anywhere else. Go to herohero.co/Kryminalny Patrol. The link is also in the description below the video.
Hi, welcome to another episode of Criminality Patrol. Well, this is another story that takes you by surprise. A terrifying story, almost unbelievable, because I'll be honest with you, I talk to my colleagues, those who are still working and those who are already retired. None of us knows of a case like this or remembers anything like it. Even abroad, I don't think it has ever happened. Some kind of monstrous mixture, a cruel crime thought out and carried out, a certain consistency in all of this, and on the other hand, such naivety, childish thinking. Thinking in such a way that it won't come out, that everything will just work out. It's always terrifying, of course, when children kill children. We made a few episodes like that. For example, the episode about the youngest murderer and rapist, the Beast of Sulikov, do you remember? A 14-year-old killed his friend who was a year younger and he raped her. It seemed like an unbelievable story too. Recently, we also had the story of that 12-year-old girl, just 12 years old, who killed her school friend who was a year younger in Jelenia Gora. So these situations do happen. It seems that it's more driven by a moment, by that instant when an impulse strikes. There isn't that kind of prolonged deliberation where someone plans the crime down to the smallest detail and then simply carries it out. Well, that usually doesn't happen with a child. This story, the story of 13-year-old Wiktoria, a small town Lini near Lwówek, near Nowy Tomyśl, that's in the Greater Poland region. There are 200 people in the village, and of course everyone knows each other, as is typical in small towns like this. Wiktoria turned 13 on March 1st last year, 2025. 2 days later, on March 3rd, which was a Monday as usual, she was coming back home. They all take a bus that brings them to and from school. She is smiling. She's a pretty girl, a brunette with nice hair. Everyone points that out, and she wears glasses. Cheerful, and you can see it even in the photos, and some people say that she looks more mature, that she looks older than her age. You would think she was older, but she was only 13 years old. It was a normal, ordinary day. She was laughing, talking, joking. Just like it usually was in the afternoon, she leaves the house and then she doesn't come back and everything starts to drag on. Of course, the parents start to worry. It's a traditional, ordinary family, parents and 3 younger brothers. She leaves the house and doesn't come back. The search begins. It's March. The days are short, so of course the day ends very quickly and it gets dark. And these searches don't bring any results. The parents notify the police and they also start searching, but without any success. The girl disappeared, vanished without a trace. The family searched everywhere. They called all their friends in the village, her classmates, her friends, and checked everywhere she could have been, like birthday parties at friends' houses, but it didn't help. And this is the next day. It's already March 4th, I remind you. All this happened a year ago. What the villagers emphasize is that the neighbors heard a terrifying scream. As it turned out, it was Wiktoria's mother's scream. It's hard to even imagine because none of us have any idea what Wiktoria's mother must have gone through when she saw her daughter hanging from a tree, actually not far, just a few hundred meters from the house. It's a road going through the forest leading to the woods and also to the lake. I would say it's a group of trees, young trees, birches, the ones that are there, and Victoria's body hanging from one of those trees in a way that I would say is unnatural, because the body was kind of lying down, kind of as if she was kneeling with a rope tightened around her neck, and she was already dead. Of course, the police did what they were supposed to do: examined the scene, secured the evidence, and all the other routine procedures. It looked like another one of those childhood tragedies where the child simply takes their own life. That's how it seemed. Unbelievable. What was happening around Victoria, at home, at school, in her everyday life? There were no signs, no one suspected anything. But sometimes there are such secrets, and indeed, even though everyone thinks it's impossible, it ends dramatically. That's how it seemed. Natomiast, however, an investigation began, because probably some of you already know how it all ends. In my career, I think I've seen dozens of people who hang themselves, and I realized that during all those years working in the criminal and investigative division, I saw a hanged woman only once. In the vast majority of cases, as you can see, it's men who hang themselves. That's really how it is. If you look at the statistics, women, including girls, hang themselves very rarely. They very rarely choose this kind of death. They jump from heights, take pills, or drown themselves in water. But suicide by hanging is, unfortunately, mostly a male phenomenon. And now, in a situation where it is a woman's suicide, I would say, from an investigator's point of view, that something is already off here. A red flag should go up. Of course, an examination is conducted. Very thoroughly, this is done by a doctor at the Forensic Medicine Institute. He checks the course of the so-called ligature mark very thoroughly. Whether this rope, this noose, matches what is on the neck. The marks will be completely different if the person was strangled. And then her death was staged. She was only hanged from a tree afterward. There will be injuries to the larynx, the hyoid bone. These are all things that show whether the person really took their own life, or if someone staged all of this. Realistically, you can imagine. The person you want to hang will defend themselves. They will fight for their life. They will fiercely try to defend themselves, to get out. Well, of course, if someone is defending themselves, they must leave plenty of different kinds of traces, or they might even injure themselves. Or the one who wants to do it must use force to do it. Therefore, there must be other kinds of traces left as well. That's how it is in the case of this kind of death. If such a person was drugged with medicines, narcotics, or other kinds of chemical substances, then these substances will also, of course, be present in the body. And during the autopsy, they will show up if the person was knocked unconscious. Well, there will also be injuries. Why am I mentioning this? I'm mentioning this because staging a death or her death, a murder disguised as a suicide, happens extremely rarely. It's practically impossible to do that. If there's a proper crime scene examination, if there's a good forensic pathologist, it has to come out. Do you remember we also did an episode about that vampire from Szczecin who also faked a death by hanging a customs office worker? Well, it immediately turned out that it was all staged. It was staged. He just wanted the police to think that the customs officer had hanged herself. Well, it was immediately determined that yes, it wasn't that she was hanged, but later on. So, in fact, it's not really possible to do that. It all takes time because the basic results of the autopsy are usually available the next day, but there are also toxicology tests. And these toxicology tests which look for various types of chemical poisons in the body, sometimes take several months. And that's what happened in this case. That's why the investigation is taking so long. I think at some point the police realized that this was a staged suicide. Up to a certain point, the case was handled by the police headquarters in Novi Tomyśl. Then it was taken over by the provincial police headquarters in Poznan. Well, but all of this was done in order to plan things here. I also think that for the police officers who realized it was staged, I would say it was hard for them to accept that someone from her circle and of a similar age could have done it. Well, but I think they took that into account. All the more so because the investigation was clearly heading in the direction that someone had hurt Wiktoria, that she was simply murdered and then it was staged. Suicide. There was a lot of talk in the village. There's this S family, especially two brothers. One of them is Alexander, who is 15 now. I would say that people spoke badly about that family. They talked about the brothers, that they're not afraid of anyone. Many people don't want to talk about them at all. They were also said to brag that they could do anything, that they could, for example, buy a weapon, that they could order it from a parcel locker and get everything there. Well, that's the belief, and it also seems that the family didn't believe from the beginning that Wiktoria committed suicide. They used to go to that place. They were even supposed to find an earring, that earring of Wiktoria's which was somewhere there. Well, that shouldn't have happened, because the crime scene examination should have been carried out so that the earring would have been found during the police examination. And it wasn't the family who found it, but for sure it was extremely difficult for them. Because on one hand there was the conviction that someone had hurt her, and on the other hand they were definitely asking themselves questions. What did we do wrong? Why did this happen? Well, these are all kinds of feelings of guilt, which in this situation are obvious. But the family insisted from the beginning that someone had to be behind this, that someone simply hurt Wiktoria. The village felt the same way. I think that when you listen to people today, many of them said that it was impossible for Wiktoria to have committed suicide. Of course, from the point of view of those who conducted the investigation, whether it was the prosecutors from Poznan or the police officers, well, it was also a very difficult case, because on the one hand it seemed like they didn't have any evidence, that they waited for the test results for some time, but even when they already knew, you have to somehow prove that someone made it look like a suicide. From the beginning, Alexander, who was 14 at the time, was suspected. But suspecting and proving are, of course, two different things. So that's something that also needs to be considered. Because on one hand, if someone like that is detained earlier and he realizes that there is no evidence, then it will only reinforce his belief that he remains unpunished. On the other hand, if, let's say, charges had been brought against him a year ago, when he was a suspect, well, those charges somehow fell through. That would probably make the case difficult as well. Also from that point of view, that the police accused or suspected a child. So the police officers here all this time, throughout this period, I suppose they initiated proceedings here. Probably both the family and the boy were having their calls monitored. They were being watched. Well, they tried to gather some materials that would confirm it. It's known that there was a search of the apartment. Presumably that's when they took the phone or phones belonging to the brothers, but as it turned out, those were some old phones. Those weren't the phones they were using at the time. The police realized it. Another search like that took place. This was already January of this year. When the police officers drove up to this family's house, even counter-terrorism officers showed up, presumably because from what they said it seemed like they might have weapons, so just in case the counter-terrorism officers came. And in January of this year the phones were secured. Those were the phones they were using. From January to March of this year, nothing happened. So here I assume that those phones were simply being examined. They tried to recover some materials that had been deleted from those phones. They succeeded. It's not out of the question that those were text messages, maybe some photos. They managed to do it. And on March 24th of this year, the police officers came again to the S family's house. And that's when Alexander, who is now 15 years old, was detained and taken away. At this moment, we know that he admitted he murdered Wiktoria, that afterwards he staged her suicide. He is 15 years old, but when he killed, he was only 14, as you probably know in Polish law there is. It is such that he can be tried as an adult for certain crimes, among others for such a crime, someone who has turned 15. So therefore Alexander will be tried as a minor, as a child. He is currently in a juvenile detention center. But we assume that he will probably also undergo a psychiatric evaluation, but that's just an assumption. Everything indicates that as a corrective measure, he will be placed in a juvenile correctional facility. Well, that's what we assume. He can stay in a juvenile correctional facility until the age of 21. So he'll be 21 years old when he gets out of the juvenile correctional facility. Well, practically his whole life is still ahead of him. So I'm also referring to the discussion that's going on about the age limit. So, at what age should someone like that be held responsible in Poland? For these crimes, it's 15 years old, but we see that there are more and more of these situations. We often also talk about this kind of psychological devastation. Very often, and children too, in Poland it's 15 years old, in Germany it's 14, in England and Wales it's just 10 years old. In the United States, in some states, it's 12 years old. It seems to me that these countries have already realized in a way that crimes, premeditated, planned crimes, can also be committed by children. That they plan in the same way adults do and are just as ruthless. That kind of unrequited love motive that Olko liked Wiktoria. But she had another crush, Patrick. Because without that, nothing would have happened. Is that motive real? Well, of course it's realistic, and it seems that's really how it is. However, it's hard to believe that for almost a year, this boy from the neighborhood, because everyone knows him, was coming around. He functioned normally, behaved as if nothing had ever happened. There's also a lot being said about his family here, especially about Alexander's mother and his brother. That they also knew about all of this, that they suspected, because after all, people in the village talked about it all the time. That the mother always took their side. She couldn't accept the thought that her son could do something like that. So I would say that the whole village knew about it. Well, the police knew too because they were trying to find evidence that it was really happening. People definitely won't forget this quickly. Even now under that tree there's a small altar with candles and flowers. People still bring them. There's even a touching letter from her friend. There's a wooden heart from her boyfriend from that, Patrick. Well, people still come. Some people come, others avoid it completely. Similarly, at the cemetery where Wiktoria was buried, her grave there is also covered in flowers and little angels. With all the things that people usually bring to children's graves, dzieci. The story is also terrifying for them because what if you cross paths with someone like that and then you find out that he committed such a crime that was planned and carried out? Because you have to imagine this wasn't an impulsive act. He had to watch her die. Then he had to cover his tracks, then live with all of it. How can a 14-year-old child do that? That's a level of calculation worthy of a hardened criminal, I'd say. Well, at this point, we know it wasn't a suicide. It was a calculated murder carried out, executed, and planned by, so to speak, a 14-year-old kid. It's unbelievable. However, from experience, I also know that this kind of murder is easier to commit if you're with someone. I think that's an open question. I think it's open. It's unlikely that Alexander was alone. He's a strong boy, even though he's still a child, but a strong boy. But would he be able to handle this situation? Personally, I doubt it. I think the police officers conducting the investigation also take that into account, that from a mental point of view, but also a technical one, carrying out something like this alone just isn't possible. It's simply not possible. But we'll see how it all turns out. Of course, there are many things we can't talk about yet because the case still hasn't gone to court, there hasn't been a trial, and there hasn't been a verdict yet. So there are many things we can't talk about. But as I said at the beginning, I talk to my colleagues, those who are working, those who used to work, a similar story. None of us have ever heard of staging a death. It usually doesn't happen like that with children. And that's it for this episode. Of course, subscribe to our channel, and as always, take care.
Chcesz oglądać Kryminalny Patrol? Pomóż nam nagrywać nowe odcinki. Support us through Hero and watch us without ads. Also get access to additional content that's not available anywhere else. Idź na herohero.co/Kryminalny Patrol. The link is also in the description below the video.